Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's great to see you all. I'm to another one of our weekly conversations on the future of work. And today we'll have an exciting one about the AI-powered future and how it might work for vocational workers. So I would like to quickly acknowledge the National Science Foundation. They're partly funding this effort, and the organizers are Linda Boyle, John Lee, Rafael Sadoun, Board Chair, Manfred Chalagi, and myself. This is a recorded session, and then questions. We're looking forward to questions, and please put those in the chat, and or it will be monitoring them. And if you can, please consider turning on your camera. We love to see faces. It's a nice community thing. So if you can, please do so. All right, so let me introduce our three guests today. So we have Divya and Nithya, who are both at Google Research India. And so Divya is, he works at the intersection of HCI and AI. And Nithya is, I believe, also in that realm. And she's looking at equitable human-AI interaction. And then Neha is at Georgia Tech, and she's interested in human-centered computing and global development. And she's also a colleague on the SICAI Executive Committee. So welcome to all three of you. And so let me get started with Divya. So we're in this conversation, we're talking about this nice Kai paper, and I think Orit will share the link to the paper if you haven't already seen it. And in this paper, you focus on workers in the global south, and specifically vocational technicians. And you say, we identify a roadmap for globally equitable future of work designs and policies. And so I was wondering if you can tell us what's at stake here? Why is this a pressing, important problem?
Sure. Firstly, thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate the opportunity. So we got sort of started thinking about this problem when we were seeing this changing nature of work around us, where there's so much discourse around these new platforms that are coming in to make money, to do different kinds of tasks and so on and so forth. And this is compounded with the fact that AI is significantly raising in its computing power, which allows it to do more and more so complex tasks. And along with this, there are public proponents for UBI because they believe that all the jobs are going to go away. So we wanted to sort of understand that, sure, there's this larger discourse around what future of work is going to be, and we talk about automation replacing jobs. So where are these people and who are these people that we are talking about when we talk about replacement through automation techniques? And we see that automation is good at replacing people, and even more so when it gets better at doing complex tasks. Initially, at least, rule-based jobs, right? Things like call center agents, data entry operators, your technicians who are factory workers doing very low-level skill jobs, right? So these are the kind of jobs which research suggests are going to get replaced. Next, we wanted to see where are these people, and when you zoom in a little bit, you see that Global South has entire industries which are built around this kind of work. And the people who are doing this are in countries like India, and the people who do this are vocational technicians, which are trained across more than 13,000 institutes in India, and there are 1.5 million graduates every year. And these are the people who are truly vulnerable to these growing trends in automation. And that is what motivated our research on how do we situate the needs of these vocational workers and understand their aspirations, their perceptions towards automation, and see what is their level of preparedness. And if at all, does technology play a role in meeting these aspirations? And having understood their aspirations and perceptions, how can we go on to define a localized future of work that really works for these workers, and understand what does it look like in Global South at large, starting with vocational technicians? So this is the context that motivated our research, and we're very excited by the findings that we have, and we'll talk more about it through the discussion today.
Yeah, so Nithya, in this paper you say, and I'm quoting here, so we found that skilling and employment platforms display algorithmic bias against our participants. So these are the vocational technicians, right? Who rely on these systems as a way to upskill and reskill in an AI-powered future. So first, what are these platforms that we're talking about? And what are some of these examples of bias? Can you maybe tell us about that?
Yeah, so first let me set some context for the vocational technicians. Who are they and what is their access like, right? So to add to what Divya was saying earlier, there's a very significant segment of people in India that are entering the vocational trade, right? And the Prime Minister Modi has famously said last decade was about IITs, this decade is about ITIs, ITIs being industrial training institutes. And there's a large goal towards skilling up 500 million Indians in a couple of years. So vocational technicians enter the trade right after 10th grade. So it's a 1 to 2 year program with a focus towards practical application and entry into trade versus the other part of 2 years more of high school and 3 years of a college degree. And so the vocational jobs tend to provide a leg up towards both social and economic mobility. Social because many of the participants that we've spoken to come from oppressed caste backgrounds, and economic because many of them come from rural and lower income segments of India. Now, vocational schools in our study use the Kannada language medium of instruction. So this is the regional language within the state of Karnataka. And it operates in the space of skilling a certain segment of people, but within a highly informal space, but very technical, right? Because that's the goal of these jobs. And the other factor to keep in mind is that since 2016, when Geo was introduced, so Geo is a carrier by Reliance Industries in India, which sort of revolutionized the access to 3G and 4G services. And so mobile internet has just taken off exponentially since that was introduced 4 years ago. And so there is greater access to higher bandwidth content. Now, again, with the caveat that our participants were in Bangalore, city, Silicon Valley of India, not generalizable across all of India in terms of access. But with these factors in mind, the students that we spoke to are active users of educational and employment platforms to augment their skills, as well as to look for jobs. And we find that present day usage tends to marginalize them in the way the design and the algorithms are constructed. And this is a worrying trend, especially as we go, as the world turns towards more digital technologies, right? And we're seeing this play out with COVID. That a large segment of people, especially of lower socioeconomic status, will probably get further and further and further marginalized as the world turns towards more and more automation and platforms. So I'll give you 3 examples of how some of these issues play out today. So one is that of searching for keywords on search platforms like YouTube and Google search to look for instructional content or practical content to go along with what is being taught in the classroom environment. So technical terms like grinding, fitting, weight machine, these are highly technical terms. When entered into these platforms, return results like grinder leads to Vitamix smoothies, right? Weight machine leads to gym videos. So we find that some of the core concepts within the vocational trade are not reflected in these platforms, and students do go to these platforms for complementary training and education. So they're not being met by these technologies. Another example is that of the increased proliferation of online education, especially in the past few years with MOOCs and nano degrees. You could even say the democratization of education that has happened. Big air quotes there. But they assume a certain technological capital, which is that of having completed high school or a college degree. So there's a big distance between skilling for data entry jobs and a Python course, right? To move towards computational thinking. And so online educational platforms don't recognize informal sector education or skilling. And they also, a very tangible way in which even if students take these courses are impacted is that, they don't get physical certificates, right? And certificates play an enormous role in many countries of the global south, where they don't just aid with social standing, but also folders of certificates are carried into job interviews. A third example is that of employment platforms like Naukri, Monster, several apps that aid with Indian government jobs. So that's its own space of searching for government jobs versus private sector jobs. And we find that our participants install several of these apps to look for notifications for when a job opens up. But then some of the larger platforms like Naukri tend to invisibilize the vocational trade, right? Because they're designed for white collar jobs, not for blue collar jobs. And so, their profiles are consistently shown as incomplete. They don't get search results for mechanical jobs or call center jobs or data entry jobs. And so the design of these systems is geared towards a certain imaginary of a high-skilled professional with a degree in mind. So all in all, vocational students turn towards platforms but are not fulfilling their aspirations today with the results that they're providing.
That's really interesting. And that sounds like not only does it harm them, but it also harms the companies that are advertising, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and yeah, it makes it, and the companies themselves may not advertise the lower level jobs
Right.
On these platforms, right? And so they often turn to WhatsApp and these informal networks, right? So social networks to look for the latest job openings and referrals. But then that also has a problematic side of, a limited network. And so the information that's present within that network, but also sometimes leading to dangerous outcomes like fake jobs, scamming and physical danger.
Got it. Thank you. So Neha, your paper identifies these 7 areas of implications for design, for social policy, and for ethical principles. And they include address gender proactively, expand vernacular, right, that's being used, as well as the data sets that are being used. So can you tell us something about these findings? And in the words of your group, you're saying identify a roadmap for a globally equitable future of work designs and policies. So how do your findings in the 7 areas lead towards that?
Sure, I can start to answer that question, and then Divya and Nithya can jump in whenever. So I think as we thought about, looking at equitable futures, there's this big question around inclusion, right, which we're kind of grappling with daily, I think. And in this paper, I think to kind of simplify it, there's 2 aspects of inclusion that we were really looking at. One is to be able to meet these workers where they're at. So to understand not just kind of what their demographics might be, but also how do they think about work? What is it that they value? What are the challenges that they encounter in the workplace, whether it is in the physical workplace or actually, engaging with digital systems that are trying to help them with their employment needs and such. And then there's the question of mobility. So where do these workers want to go? What are their aspirations for their futures? How do we think about the technologies that they're using in terms of how they're um, affording them mobility, or how they're coming in the way? And our recommendations are basically aligned with kind of these two factors. So where are they at now? What are the things to keep in mind as we move forward? And so the recommendations we have around, say, addressing gender proactively, right, is thinking about, well, many ways, and we're familiar with this. These are kind of some realities that cross over, right? And we've seen them in the US context and in many other parts of the world. So with regards to how we look at women and their work, and, you know, um, thinking about care work, but also then going beyond that and thinking about more kind of more diverse gender identities, or looking at how there might be issues like caste that come into play in workplaces, and how to think about being sensitive to those as we move forward, the value that work might have. And this also comes, I mean, there are interesting questions that come up if we think about COVID, for instance, right? Because we had conversations with them about UBI, and it wasn't really considered adequate compensation. And generally, there was this stigma around not doing work and receiving free income. But things like, in situations like COVID, have brought that under question. But I think broadly speaking, there were some very concrete suggestions that Nithya also kind of referred to in terms of the systems that we build and how those could be more inclusive, not just in terms of, say, language, but also thinking about vernacular, also thinking about different demographics and the different kinds of work that they speak to. So I guess those are some of the main recommendations that we made. Divya, do you want to add to that? Nithya?
I'm certainly fascinated by the idea of UBI and the pros and cons. Right, on the one hand, it's sort of this insurance that might enhance your ability to go out on a limb, get education, start a business. But on the other hand, it might also be a way to just tell you, we honestly just don't need you, and here's some money so that you wouldn't revolt. So I don't know how that, I guess to some extent that's what you're seeing, or that's what you also saw people felt like, perhaps.
I think that brings, that is especially interesting when we think about mobility, right? So if work is seen as a way of moving up in the world in different dimensions of sort of moving up, right? Different dimensions of mobility, then how does UBI kind of enable that is a question. I don't know if you want to add to that.
And UBI, so that's, what is it? Universal basic income, right? So some sort of a basic allowance from the government through taxpayer money, presumably.
And adding to what Neha said, right? I mean, work is such a central place for their identity and their social standing, right? To the extent that it's displayed proudly on your marriage resumes in the arranged marriage that you go through. It's a very integral part of who you are, because you're migrants from sort of rural areas to urban areas, and you form strong bonds with your colleagues at the workplace, and that becomes a part of your life, a very important one, much so to that. So along with this, there's this entire fact that, as Nithya was mentioning, that these are oppressed castes, and these are castes which have been oppressed for a very long time. So there's been systemic ways in which they've tried to accrue more social capital, and anything which is like a straight answer like UBI fails to understand that there's so much social capital that's gone beyond reaching from, say, n to n+5 to and maybe towards their eventual goal. So anything specifically social policies we design and have to keep this in mind that there's some wealth of social capital that they've tried to gain, and at the same time they try to gain a lot of community capital at the workplace. We've seen constant workplace negotiations, like working overtime without not having issues with working overtime without pay, because they want to gather that community capital with their employer because they have so much faith that in case something happens to them, like an accident or they need some money, they might be able to do that too. So there's a lot of complexity with how their relationship with work is and how it's such a central part of their identity.
Yeah, I also want to add, connected to UBI is the notion of automation, right? As these are fairly mechanical jobs. They're repeated, predictable jobs viewed from a certain lens, and so they are potentially susceptible to automation, say through robots or AI bots, right, for data entry and call center jobs, computer vision, whatnot. So we find that, and to add to what Divya was saying, we find that machines were seen as purely mechanical tools and not as cognitively or socially intelligent. The way, and that's a big discord, right? We're part of Google Research, and we're at the cutting edge of AI, and the way AI is imagined here is very different from how our vocational community was seeing AI. Many of them were not even aware of AI or all this hype that's going around in policy circles and governments around future of work and loss of jobs. And we're also, there have been Pew surveys that show that many Americans are concerned with the loss of jobs, right? It's very much a part of the discourse here. Whereas in the community that we worked with, they were not aware of some of these trends that were going on around automation. And the way the machine was imagined was also very interesting. It stems from the learning that they have around technical trade of machines as being purely mechanical. And so when we think about implications of automation, replacing people with machines was seen as something that was fairly impossible to do, because vocational workers said that they bring leadership skills, they bring creativity, and they bring these management skills, and also the skill and the beauty in operating these machines, which can't be easily replaced, right? So perceptions of automation are very important to understand. And I think overall in this future of work discourse, it's important to work with the communities that are at risk of displacement to understand their views and fears and concerns with increased automation, and not just do it top down the way it's done today.
Great, thank you, Nithya. I want us to transition into questions from the audience. So for the audience, feel free to type in your questions. And I would like to start with a question. I think that you're emphasizing here community and the importance of hearing and understanding the perspectives of audiences that unfortunately are new to our literature on kind of human-computer interaction in the future of work. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your methodology of working and expanding the way that you bring community and that you bring different perspective into this conversation. I think that it's important to do it right when you go and reach out to different populations. So I'd love to hear about your experience. I will let you decide, like just unmute yourself and kind of jump in.
I can take a very quick first stab and hand it over to Nithya and Neha. So yeah, great question, right? Especially when we are working with communities that are at the risk of automation. How do we convey the message of automation, especially when they're not aware of automation is an important consideration that we kept in our research. So the first thing about this study was that it was based on participatory action research. So it was a very involved study with our participants where there were frequent tasks and situations that we gave to our participants. And there's also some context that we set. So for younger students in this group who are trying to look at different methods, we found this study pattern to be extremely helpful to work with marginalized communities. So anyone who's looking to do study in similar backgrounds could consider participatory action research and draw some motivation also from our method. We kept very special attention to conveying message about automation. It was constantly reiterated with our participants to make them feel comfortable and let them explicitly know to back out of the study whenever they feel comfortable. And this would have no correlation to them getting the incentive or not, because they had some incentive associated by participating in the study. And at the same time, we actively made sure that this seemed very hypothetical to them, at the same time real. So it wasn't as if it seemed like a direct threat to them right now, which would scare them or make them wary of automation. But at the same time, we do acknowledge that exposing students, the communities, to automation when they do not have ideas about it could have some negative repercussions. But we did actively try to mitigate them through our participatory action research. I'll hand it over to Neha and Nithya in case you have more thoughts on this.
Just a caveat, in our study and also a reflection of reality, it was very difficult to find women participants as part of the research. Divya, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Sorry, I couldn't get the last one. I was looking at the chat question, sorry.
Just a caveat that it was harder to get women participants because they're just so, they're not represented in the trade as much.
Right. So all the participants that we had in our study who were female came from actually the computing trades, where you see higher participation of women. And that's why what Neha was mentioning, right? The gendered element of work is very important, because women who are employed in these trades which are at the high risk of automation. So in a society where anyway the overall participation of women is around 26-28%, how do we not further stigmatize that by automation would be an important consideration. I think we have a few questions on the chat.
Yes, great. Well, thank you. Let's take some questions from the audience. Shantanu, do you want to kind of unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh yeah, sure. I was typing it out because my internet is absolutely terrible, but I'll just read out what I wrote. So I'm a master's student in HPI and design, currently working on my thesis. And as part of this thesis, I'm working with gig work platforms and workers to see what potential future technologies or potential future products could be created for them, right? And one term which kept popping up in my conversation with these product managers and designers and researchers as initiatives that their platform was giving. And so their intention was to teach the gig workers what they termed as soft skills, or things like interpersonal communication, how to communicate when you have a woman passenger in your taxi, and so on and so forth. And interestingly, some digital literacy, that how to use a smartphone, how to keep it charged, how to navigate the interface. And I thought this was really interesting, because when I spoke to workers about this, they said that they wanted to learn skills so that they could move on to other jobs, and they only saw gig work as a path to something else. And from what I read in the paper, it applies to people enrolled currently in vocational education programs. But would you say that the conclusions you've drawn could apply to other workers as well?
Neha, Nithya.
Thank you, Chandra. I think at least I heard part of the question, but if one of the speakers wants to respond, I think the focus is on kind of mobility and kind of using kind of the current training as an opportunity to move on to different industries and different training.
And does it apply not only to people in vocational training right now, but other workers as well? How does it generalize over other segments of the working population?
Exactly.
Neha, Nithya, I've spoken a lot, so I'll hand it off to both of you first.
Nithya, you want to take this?
I would like for Nithya to back me up on this, but my sense is these are not necessarily transferable skills, at least what's being offered in the educational institutes, right? They're highly specific to the trade. And in fact, we're finding that technology platforms, which are complementary, are not even meeting them in reaching that goal. But we have also seen, and there are probably parallels here with other aspects of gig work, like data work and taxi driving. But then I'm not exactly sure how vocational skills would transfer over there. Divya, do you want to take this?
I guess one important part of it, which is sort of that we saw even in our study, was how our vocational community wanted to professionalize themselves, right? So knowing how to talk in interviews, how to touch up their resumes, and for that they ended up frequently paying to things like cyber center personhood. They pay like say 300 rupees or $5 uh, to professionalize their profile. So any form of that knowledge, the soft skill part of it is certainly important. They're taught some of this even in their institutes, and they do look up videos for it and text for it, even on search platforms is what we found. In terms of transferring these over to gig workers, for example, of what vocational the findings that we have. So why it's significantly different is because our community specifically wants full-time jobs. We did speak about gig work to them. They had very little visibility into it, but through the participatory action research, we tried to elicit some responses, and we found that that is always seen as an additional method to gain something. Do keep in mind that these are workers from economically marginalized backgrounds who want stability, financial stability, as well as social stability of having a coveted government job or a cushy private job, right? So for them, hence, the findings of gig work cannot directly be translated because they work in organizations full time. Uh, so yeah, that's what I'd say. Neha, maybe if you have more thoughts on this.
No, I just wanted to say that there was a link that Savita shared that might be relevant. So that's an ICTD 2020 paper, I think.
Thank you. And I also kind of refer us back to one of the conversations that we had earlier this year with Dr. Raffaella Sadun from Harvard Business School, who talked about programs of skilling and reskilling in Italy, specifically thinking with workers about what are kind of the soft transferable skills that could help them lead to new careers. And she kind of gave the example like a technician that had been working on a very specific machine, perhaps have this skill of attention to details or ability to kind of solve technical problems that could be transferred, and how to integrate this new way of thinking about skills that are not only technical of how to connect these two pieces together and move them and integrate them into training programs. But I want to call again to Shantanu. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Hey, I've spoken to Nithya I like about the paper before, but there was one thing that like kind of struck me, and I think it's been there for the discourse otherwise also. It's why is UBI seen as a choice between work and UBI versus instead of something that supplements work as well? Because once, let's say, we reach a stage where we are not really able to reskill if something like that exists or upskill workers at in a given time frame, isn't UBI just like any other social security? So I want to know where I understand the terms of social capital, but I don't really get why that stigma exists, or can it be done away with now that we have a little more data on how the stimulus check during COVID was received and appreciated in the US economy and other economies. Yeah. So
Neha, do you want to take this first?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's a couple of questions that you're asking, right? One is, what is actually the value of work, I guess? And so how do people kind of make that choice? And so that goes back to some of the things that we talked about initially about just what work means in terms of mobility, what work means in terms of social, cultural capital. And it isn't just about the income. But I think what you're saying about, in times of COVID, I think that that's absolutely on point. And I would be very curious to know how that has impacted people's views, because when you see, again, it's about kind of this implicit comparison that you're making, right, with other people. So where you're at, where other people are at. And in these current times, I think there's a much wider sense of we're all in this together. And so I wonder how that kind of shapes this need to be in a workplace and to have that adding value to one's life. So that might be a factor. I don't know. Divya, you want to add to that?
No, that's very good. So just one quick thing on top of that is, so we did, the reason why this was so opposed was because it was such a centerpiece, right? So as a bridge between, say, finding new employment and being unemployed because of, say, automation techniques is something that could be considered as a policy, but do realize that work still holds a central part in their identity and even in their just general day-to-day life, and they do want that. But if it is kept as a stimulus by the time they find new work because automation has replaced them, and this check is sort of to, say, help them with learning new skills and at the same time support their families, that's absolutely taken for. And there's also this resistance towards these sort of policies because they have little risk appetite, right? Because they have to take care of their families. So anything that is not consistent and constant and has some form of uncertainty that this might not come along next month is not great. And hence they have this self-sufficiency. And one of the reasons we found why these vocational community workers wanted to even get into technical fields was because they thought that this was not a thing that needed, social networks or connections to get a new job, because technical skills would get them those jobs. So there's a lot of this faith on having self-sustainable sources of income, and maybe that's the reason you're seeing this strong opposition. Uh, I do want to be slightly mindful of time. There's quite a few questions.
Yeah, I think that
Savita
would be
had.
a good.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I wanted to, I think that's a good transition to Neil's question, talking about kind of social network. Neil, would you want to ask your question?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for this amazing work. I think it is super important, given this is one of the sectors that not many people have looked in before. So hats off to all of you for taking that lead. So my question is, like, in crowd work or gig work, let's say Amazon Mechanical Turk or other aspects of micro and macro crowd work, we always see the platform owners, like let's say Amazon or other big leaders, they usually will not create tools and support systems for workers and their well-being. So workers will organize themselves and create communities for protecting each other, protecting their mental health, standing up against requesters who behave unethically. So I was wondering, in your research, did you find similar activities in the context of vocational workers? So what did you learn from that, and what can we extend across different kind of works, like vocational work? Then there are other issues like immigrant workers, gig workers, and all. So it would be interesting to kind of look at that space at the meta level.
Thank you. Anyone want to kind of respond from the panel?
Nithya, do you want to take that?
How about you go first?
Sure. Perfect. Thanks, Neil. Thank you so much for the appreciation too. We do believe so. It's important work. So yeah, that's good validation. So yeah, we did actually see quite a lot of peer support that came across, and a lot of this was actually seen in workplace relationships that they had. So the first piece, especially in the participatory research, because we spoke about a lot of case-based scenarios. So first thing that we found was exactly what you spoke about for gig workers too, right? They wanted a transparent and an accountable channel to speak to the upper management whenever decisions regarding them and their work were made. So that was one thing that came out very, very strongly. Second thing came out in form of sort of legal measures that they wanted to have, or legal safeguards, so to say, things like having higher notice periods, or having a way to find different jobs for people in the same company, getting choices to upskill or reskill themselves, and having the company accountable for some of these practices. And also the importance of unions came out quite strongly because that was seen as a channel to talk about their issues and have, for example, a few of our participants proposed things like having a mandatory ratio of people is to machines in a company, and they found that any form of unions would actually protect them from some of these measures. So it's very important, right? And more so, and much more so for marginalized communities, to give them transparent communication channels, be it through technological platforms, be it through company policies or social policies that government could have. It's extremely important because it's very easy to not hear these voices. And we need to, because it concerns decisions that are directly affecting them. So absolutely the kind of things that you're seeing for MTurk is, or any of these gig platforms could easily be replicable for them in their own channels. And a lot of the communication that happens in places like WhatsApp, right, or Facebook. So it's more so important to communicate to them where they are at. But absolutely, we did find a lot of these peer support networks, and we saw very important things like, if a machine replaces my colleague's job, who will teach me, or who will I teach or have interactions with? So there's also this social support system that they looked out in their peers, and also to train themselves for new skills that they might not know and their colleagues might. Nithya, I'll hand it off to you, or Neha.
Yeah, I just want to add that, generally the way gig work is shaping up is that it's a large decentralized platform, right? So there is no real employer. The employer is Uber, for example. Um, and But then this has a different version in countries like India and Bangladesh, right, which have been well documented by our research community. In terms of, there's a taxi agency that taxi drivers borrow cars from, rent cars from, and then that is being used for Uber. So there's an intermediary in the loop. There's an interesting implication from our study on not just peer communities, but also the relationship with employers. It was this love-hate relationship, but there was a strong understanding in many cases that employers are empathetic humans, although in positions of authority, and not wanting to, putting in extra hours so that they could gain that capital for times when they have to take days off for emergencies in the family, for example, and replacing that employer with a machine, or just cutting out the employer or the middleman has some interesting implications for the social structures that are being built today.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I can just add a little bit to that, because we've done some work, to address Neil's question. In the case of Uber in Bangladesh, and then in the case of Airbnb here in Atlanta. And so looking at online communities of practice, really, and how different gig workers kind of, actually in the case of Airbnb, it was gig workers who were engaging with these online groups and learning from each other and learning kind of and so we looked at sort of how you start out being kind of on the peripheries and how you become expert as you go along and you kind of learn the tricks of the trade, so to speak. In Uber, it was a little bit different. It wasn't really the Uber drivers, but it was the passengers, the users of the system who were engaging and trying to learn, again, how to navigate that space. And yeah, in both we saw sort of similar learning happening in the online groups.
Thank you. And I want to take one more question from Alberta.
Yeah, hi. It's interesting how you talk about the way the peers learn from each other. I was just curious as to what do you think we can do to bridge the gap between vocational workers who, for instance, have worked in a certain industry for, say, 10 plus years and are used to doing one particular kind of job for a number of years. They've gained some soft skills along the way, and now you're telling them their machine needs to be automated. I think I'm just curious as to how we can actually help those kinds of people transition to an automated device.
Who wants to kind of take this?
I could go first, I guess, and then you guys can add. I think, yeah, this goes back to, I guess, the learnability of these systems, right, and how we think about learnability, which is a little bit different from, I guess, usability. And at a high level, I think it involves really kind of trying to focus on that phase of like learning to use a system and what that entails, and making sure that we factor that into, I guess, the research that we do. But I guess from an industry perspective, when you're rolling out products like these, I don't know how you would speak about it from that end. Nithya, Divya.
I guess one important consideration, thanks for that question, is how do we build like a cultural context of what automation is? And one of the recommendations in our study is actually to build some form of like AI education for vocational technicians. And even when you look at sort of the policy scene in India right now, central boards are actually pushing for AI education even at high school level. So there's this growing need that if you know about automation more, so you'll be much more understanding of what its promise is and what extent can it do things and not have this like sci-fi like idea of automation, or in our case of vocational community where there's not even basic understanding of the techniques of it. So I think building out that sort of curriculum with cultural figures, locally relevant characters, is extremely important, and in a language that they understand. So there's certainly a lot of potential over there to understand how can we even make AI like a fundamentally understandable thing and not just like far off concept or an alien concept. Totally. So yeah, that's an interesting argument.
Yeah, I'll just add on a finding that we are seeing in a current study on algorithmic fairness in India. Is that AI tends to be held within an ivory tower and is not well understood even by those in positions of power that are deciding to implement these technologies, right? So, for example, we've seen that the judiciary is debating whether to include AI, but there is no real understanding about accuracy of these systems. Like facial recognition has only 2% accuracy in Delhi, which is ridiculous. So there's a big gap between where things are at today and how AI is shrouded with power and hype versus making it a public project and as basic as language literacy and other skills in life.
Thank you. This is a comment from my student Divya, and that goes with Divya's comment about language. And so voice interface is in a regional language, but also I think you mentioned, Divya, the language that is being used. So anyway, just wanted to quickly mention that. But other than that, I really wanted to thank the three of you for joining us today. This was really very exciting to hear. Highly relevant topic as this future of work develops as we're looking at it, as people are, many people are losing their jobs and many people are going to be looking to find new ways to make a living. And then I was really fascinated by the discussion about not only the technical aspect of this and then the sort of bread and butter aspect of this, but also the societal aspect of how do you fit in, where do you find your colleagues, where do you find, what is your life really, how is it defined, and all of that's going to be impacted. So thank you for sharing the work that you've done with us.
And I just want to also mention that there is a great discussion happening in the chat. So we are going to save the chat and publish it together with the video, but thank you everyone for commenting, sharing additional resources. I like that there is kind of a lively back channel discussion happening in the background.
So we'll have a few more minutes. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just saying special thanks to Dr. Savita, who's been moderating some of that and helping with a lot of resources. So thank you for that, Dr. Savita.
Yeah, I've been such a fan of Savita's work for so long. It's so nice to have you here.
Yes, plus 100. Mutual admiration. This is so interesting.
Very good. So we'll stay on for a few minutes. I just wanted to quickly mention that next week, our guest will be David Iman Sharma, and he's also a colleague from SIG-CHI Executive Committee, and he will be talking about AI, XR, and the future of work. So you can find the link and the Zoom information, calendar item in that link that I just posted in the chat. So hopefully you'll be able to join us. And at this point, I'll stop the recording and let's stick around for a few more minutes if you can.